Imagine the teacher who told you that you'd never amount to anything. Then picture hiring that same person to clean your house because you've become wildly successful. That's my story. What started as a humiliating moment in high school turned into the ultimate comeback, complete with a twist I never saw coming. High school was a minefield, and I was one of those kids who seemed to hit every explosive. I wasn't the star athlete, the class clown, or the straight-A student. I was just there, quiet, awkward, and struggling to keep my head above water in most of my classes. But if I had to pick a subject that truly felt like my nemesis, it was math. Numbers and equations seemed to mock me. I'd stare at the problems on the board, feeling like they were written in a foreign language. No matter how many hours I spent trying to understand, it never clicked. Homework was torture, tests were nightmares, and every time I handed an assignment, I knew I was setting myself up for another failure. Mrs. Reed, my math teacher, didn't make things any easier. She was the kind of teacher who demanded perfection and had zero tolerance for students who couldn't keep up. Rumor had it she'd once made a senior cry during finals week, and I was pretty sure she enjoyed it. One particularly bad day, we were handed back our latest test results. As soon as I saw the red 34% scrawled across the top of my paper, my stomach sank. I'd stayed up all night studying, convinced that this time I'd at least pass. But here was another failure staring me in the face. Mrs. Reed stood at the front of the room, her gaze sharp as a hawk's. "Class," she announced, holding up a handful of tests. "I'm deeply disappointed in some of these results." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Please don't single me out," I thought. "Please don't." "Alex," she said, her voice slicing through the air like a knife. My heart stopped. "Would you care to explain how you managed to fail again?" The room went dead silent. Every head turned to me, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and pity. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. "You'll never succeed in life if you can't even pass basic math," Mrs. Reed continued, her tone dripping with condescension. "What kind of future do you think you'll have if you can't do something as simple as this?" Her words hit me like a freight train. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, my vision blurring with unshed tears. I wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor and never come back. The laughter that rippled through the room was faint, but it felt like a roar in my ears. That night, I went home and locked myself in my room. I stared at my test paper for what felt like hours, replaying Mrs. Reed's words over and over in my head. "You'll never succeed." They weren't just words. They were a verdict, a confirmation of every fear and insecurity I'd ever had about myself. I tried to shake it off, but it clung to me like a shadow. For days, I went through the motions, avoiding eye contact with everyone and barely speaking. My mom noticed, of course. "What's wrong, Alex?" she asked one evening, her voice gentle. "You've been so quiet lately." When I finally broke down and told her what had happened, she was furious. "No one gets to decide your future except you," she said firmly, her eyes blazing with anger. "You're so much more than what some teacher thinks of you." Her words were meant to comfort me, but at the time, they felt hollow. How could I prove Mrs. Reed wrong when I couldn't even pass a test? The humiliation of that day didn't fade quickly. For weeks, I avoided participating in class, terrified of drawing Mrs. Reed's attention again. But something strange started to happen. The more her words echoed in my mind, the less they felt like an insult, and the more they felt like a challenge. Somewhere deep down, a fire began to spark. I didn't know how or when, but I decided that one day, I'd prove her wrong. I didn't realize it at the time, but that moment, the worst day of my life, was about to become the turning point that changed everything. For weeks after that humiliating day in Mrs. Reed's class, her words followed me like an unwanted shadow. "You'll never succeed," she'd said, and every time I thought about it, a mix of anger and despair would wash over me. I avoided eye contact in the hallways, slouched in my seat during her lectures, and dreaded math class like it was a daily punishment. At first, it felt like giving up was my only option. If my own teacher didn't think I was capable, why should I bother trying? I considered just coasting through the rest of the year, scraping by with a bare minimum until I could leave her class and her judgment behind. But then, something started to shift. Slowly, the despair began to morph into something else. Anger. It wasn't just anger at Mrs. Reed for saying what she did, though there was plenty of that. It was anger at myself for letting her words define me. Why was I giving her so much power? Who was she to decide my future? One night, after yet another frustrating attempt at math homework, I snapped. I tossed my notebook across the room and yelled out in frustration. My mom, hearing the commotion, came to check on me. "What's going on, Alex?" she asked, her concern etched into every word. At first, I didn't want to say anything, but as she sat down beside me, her patience made the words spill out. I told her about Mrs. Reed, about the test, about how small and incapable I felt every time I walked into that classroom. By the time I was finished, my cheeks were streaked with tears, and I could barely look at her. My mom's reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't offer pity or tell me it would be okay. Instead, she got angry, fiercely, protectively angry. "No one gets to decide your future except you," she said, her voice firm but full of love. "You are not defined by what someone else thinks of you. You're capable of more than you realize, Alex." Her words hit me differently than anything I'd heard before. They weren't just comforting, they were a challenge. For the first time, I felt a small but undeniable spark of determination. The next day, I made a decision. I was going to prove Mrs. Reed wrong. I didn't have a grand plan or a sudden burst of confidence. What I had was a flicker of hope, and I knew I had to start somewhere. So, I began with the basics. I asked a couple of friends for help with my homework, friends who didn't judge me for struggling and were patient enough to walk me through the problem step by step. I also discovered a treasure trove of online tutorials. I spent hours watching videos and practicing problems, pausing and rewinding until I started to grasp the concepts that had once seemed impossible. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of moments when I wanted to throw in the towel. But every time I solved the problem correctly, no matter how small, it felt like a victory. The real turning point came one afternoon when I managed to ace a small quiz in Mrs. Reed's class. It wasn't worth a lot of points, but when she handed back my paper with a "well done" scrawled in red ink, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just about impressing her anymore. It was about proving to myself that I was capable. That one success gave me the confidence to keep going. I started studying harder for tests, dedicating extra time to my weakest areas. My grades didn't skyrocket overnight, but they began to climb steadily. And with each small improvement, I felt the weight of Mrs. Reed's words lifting off my shoulders. For the first time, I started to believe that maybe she was wrong about me. Maybe I wasn't doomed to fail. Maybe I could create my own path one step at a time. What I didn't realize then was that this journey wasn't just about passing math class or silencing a critical teacher. It was about discovering a resilience within myself that I hadn't known was there. As I worked toward proving Mrs. Reed wrong, I was also proving something far more important, that I had the strength to face challenges head-on and the determination to rise above them. And that realization was just the beginning of a transformation I never saw coming. As I kept pushing myself to improve in school, something unexpected began to happen. While I was still wrestling with equations and formulas in math class, I started to notice I had a knack for something else entirely: problem solving. Not the textbook kind, where you solve for X, but the kind that required thinking outside the box. It started small. I'd find myself helping friends figure out creative ways to tackle group projects or brainstorming new approaches to assignments that stumped others. Even in subjects where I struggled, like math, I could sometimes come up with shortcuts or unconventional methods that made the problems less daunting. At first, I didn't think much of it. I just assumed I was finding ways to compensate for my academic weaknesses. But one day, in my economics class, we were assigned a project that would change everything. The assignment was simple on paper, but daunting in practice: create a mock business. We had to come up with an original idea, outline a business plan, and present it to the class as if we were pitching to investors. The teacher even added a twist. Each team would be competing for the title of Best Business Idea, judged by a panel of teachers. Most of my classmates groaned at the assignment, but for some reason, I felt a spark of excitement. This was different from anything I'd done before. It wasn't about memorizing facts or solving equations. It was about creating something new. I teamed up with two friends, and we spent the first few days brainstorming ideas. At first, nothing felt right. Every concept seemed boring or overdone. But one night, as I was scrolling through social media, inspiration struck. I noticed how many people complained about never having enough time to organize their schedules, track their habits, or stay productive. The next day, I pitched the idea to my team: a service that combined physical planners with a personalized app to help people stay organized in both their personal and professional lives. My friends loved it, and we got to work immediately. I poured my heart into the project, working late into the night sketching designs for the planner and creating mock-ups for the app interface. I researched real-world business models, pricing strategies, and marketing techniques. For the first time, I felt like I was in my element. When it came time to present our idea, I was nervous but excited. Standing in front of the class, I explained how our product worked, who it was designed for, and why it was different from anything else on the market. My teammates added their parts, but I was the one driving the pitch. When we finished, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted in applause. Even the teachers on the panel looked impressed. One of them, who had a reputation for being hard to please, called our idea innovative and well thought out. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had something to offer. The sense of accomplishment was overwhelming, and it planted a seed of possibility in my mind. That project didn't just earn us the title of Best Business Idea. It sparked something inside me, a deep interest in entrepreneurship. I realized that the same creative problem-solving skills I'd used in the project could be applied to real-life situations. After the project ended, I couldn't stop thinking about the idea of starting my own business someday. I began devouring every resource I could find on the subject. Books, podcasts, YouTube videos, and online articles. I learned about everything from how to identify a target audience to the basics of financial management. The more I studied, the more excited I became about the possibilities. It wasn't just about making money. It was about creating something meaningful, something that solved problems and made people's lives better. And for the first time, I felt like I'd found a direction, a purpose that didn't rely on anyone else's approval, least of all Mrs. Reed's. Looking back, that school project was a turning point. It taught me that success wasn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It was about discovering your strengths and using them to carve out your own path. And while I wasn't sure where that path would lead yet, I knew one thing for certain. I was just getting started. After high school, I found myself at a crossroads. College was the obvious choice for many of my classmates, but I wasn't sure it was the right path for me. The thought of spending 4 more years sitting in classrooms, struggling to keep up, felt suffocating. And honestly, I didn't know what I wanted to study or where I wanted to go. Instead, I decided to take a different route. I found a part-time job at a local coffee shop to pay the bills while I figured things out. The work was simple but steady, and it gave me enough free time to explore my interests. Around that same time, I stumbled across an idea that would change everything. During my senior year of high school, I'd gotten into the habit of making handmade notebooks and planners. It started as a hobby, something to help me stay organized and creative, but people began noticing them. Friends would compliment the designs, and a few even asked if I could make custom ones for them. One day, while scrolling through social media, I saw a post about someone who'd turned their craft hobby into a thriving online business. That post planted a seed in my mind. Could I do the same? Could I turn my handmade planners into something more than just a hobby? I decided to give it a shot. With a little savings from my coffee shop job, I bought some materials and set up an online shop. I didn't expect much at first, just a way to make a little extra cash and test the waters. The first few months were tough. My shop barely got any traffic, and the few sales I made were from friends or family. I started to doubt whether I'd made the right decision. Was this just a waste of time? But then, I remembered the lessons I'd learned during that mock business project in high school. Success didn't happen overnight. It took experimentation, persistence, and a willingness to adapt. I threw myself into learning everything I could about online marketing. I watched countless tutorials on how to take better product photos, write compelling descriptions, and use social media to reach new customers. I revamped my shop's branding, creating a cohesive look that reflected the personality of my products. Slowly but surely, things started to change. One day, I woke up to find that a popular Instagram account had shared one of my planners, and my shop saw a sudden surge in traffic. That week, I made more sales than I had in the previous 3 months combined. Encouraged by this small success, I doubled down. I started experimenting with new designs and introducing limited edition collections. I also began engaging more with my customers, asking for feedback and using their suggestions to improve my products. Within a year, my side hustle had grown into something much bigger. What started as a small online shop had turned into a full-fledged business. I was still working part-time at the coffee shop, but my evenings and weekends were consumed with fulfilling orders, brainstorming new ideas, and managing the logistics of running a growing operation. It wasn't easy. There were late nights and early mornings, moments of self-doubt, and the constant challenge of balancing work, life, and my side hustle. But every time I saw a new order come in or received a message from a happy customer, it reminded me why I was doing this. For the first time, I felt a sense of purpose. I wasn't just working for a paycheck. I was building something that was mine, something I could be proud of. Looking back, those early days of my business taught me some of the most valuable lessons of my life. I learned the importance of perseverance, the power of adaptability, and the incredible satisfaction of seeing hard work pay off. What started as a simple experiment to make extra cash had turned into a foundation for my future. And though I didn't realize it at the time, this small side hustle was just the beginning of a journey that would take me farther than I ever imagined. In the second year of running my small business, I hit a plateau. Sales were steady, but not exceptional, and the excitement of those first milestones was starting to wear off. I was working harder than ever, juggling orders, managing my online store, and trying to stay ahead of the competition. I couldn't help but wonder if this was as far as I'd go. Then, one random Thursday, everything changed. It started with a social media post from a popular lifestyle influencer. I'd sent them one of my planners months ago, hoping they might feature it in their content, but I hadn't heard anything since. I'd almost forgotten about it when, out of nowhere, they posted a glowing review on their Instagram. The post wasn't just a quick mention. It was a full breakdown of why they love the product, complete with stunning photos and a link to my website. Within minutes, my phone started buzzing with order notifications. By the end of the day, my shop had sold out of almost every item. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. I stayed up late into the night, restocking inventory, answering customer inquiries, and trying to process what had just happened. The next morning, the buzz hadn't died down. In fact, it had only grown. More influencers were sharing the post, and my follower count on social media was skyrocketing. The orders kept pouring in, and it quickly became clear that I couldn't handle the demand on my own. I needed help fast. I put out a call for part-time assistance, and within a week, I had a small team working with me. My apartment turned into a makeshift warehouse, with stacks of planners and shipping supplies taking up every available inch of space. My neighbors probably hated me for the constant stream of delivery trucks, but I didn't care. As chaotic as it was, I loved every second of it. For the first time, I felt like I was running a real business, a business that people were excited about. The kid who couldn't pass math class was now overseeing a team, managing inventory, and pulling in profits I'd never dreamed of. It felt surreal. Every time I looked at my sales numbers, I had to pinch myself to make sure it was real. This was the kind of success I'd always thought was out of reach, the kind of success Mrs. Reed had insisted I'd never achieve. Speaking of Mrs. Reed, she was never far from my mind during this time. Her words, though hurtful, had been a strange source of motivation for me. Every success felt like a small victory over the doubts she'd planted in my mind. I'd sometimes catch myself daydreaming about running into her, maybe at the grocery store or a local event, and casually mentioning my thriving business. Part of me wanted to see the look on her face, to make her realize how wrong she'd been about me. But another part of me wondered if it even mattered. Wasn't the best revenge simply living well? My life was proof that I didn't need her approval, or anyone else's for that matter. As my business continued to grow, I started investing in new ideas and expanding my product line. I hired more staff, moved operations into a small warehouse, and even launched a separate website for digital planner templates. Each milestone felt like a reminder of how far I'd come and how much potential I still had. But even as I focused on the future, the past still lingered. Mrs. Reed's voice echoed in my mind during quiet moments, reminding me of the doubt and humiliation I'd felt in her classroom. I didn't resent her anymore, but I couldn't ignore the role she'd played in shaping my journey. One day, I told myself I'd cross paths with her again. When that day came, I wouldn't need to say much. My success would speak for itself. A few years after my business took off, life felt like it was finally falling into place. I had a steady rhythm, a supportive team, and the kind of stability I'd only dreamed of in high school. My days were filled with work that I genuinely loved, and my nights were my own. But no matter how far I'd come, my hometown always had a way of pulling me back. This time, it was for a family event, a cousin's wedding that required me to return to the small town where I'd spent so many of my most awkward years. I wasn't thrilled about the trip at first. While I was excited to see my family, the thought of running into old acquaintances dredged up memories I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit. But as the weekend unfolded, it turned out to be more pleasant than I'd expected. At least until I went to pick up a last-minute gift at the local store. The moment I walked through the door, I spotted her, Mrs. Reed. She was standing in the aisle, studying a shelf of greeting cards. For a second, I wasn't even sure it was her. The woman in front of me looked different from the stern, commanding teacher I remembered. Her posture was slightly hunched, and her face bore the wear of time. She looked older, tired, and somehow smaller. I considered slipping away unnoticed, but before I could make my move, she glanced up and locked eyes with me. There was a brief pause, then a flicker of recognition in her expression. "Oh, hello," she said, her tone surprisingly warm. "You're one of my former students, aren't you?" I nodded, unsure how to respond. Her voice, her presence, it all came rushing back in an instant. I could almost hear the echo of her scathing words in my mind, reminding me of the humiliation I'd felt in her class. Yes, I'm Alex, I replied evenly. I was in your math class. Her smile widened, and for a moment, I thought she might say something kind or nostalgic. But instead, she tilted her head, as if trying to place me in her memory. Alex, Alex? Oh yes, she said finally. I remember you. You struggled a bit, didn't you? I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my composure. I did, I said simply, not giving her the satisfaction of seeing any discomfort. She nodded, apparently oblivious to the weight of her words. Well, I always hoped my students would find their way, even if math wasn't their strong suit. It was a strange moment. I'd imagined running into her 100 times over the years, picturing dramatic confrontations or triumphant declarations of my success. But now that it was happening, it felt anticlimactic. So, what are you up to these days? She asked, clearly trying to make polite conversation. This was it, the moment I'd dreamed of, the chance to tell her exactly how wrong she'd been about me. I took a breath and said, I run my own business. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, and for the first time, she seemed genuinely interested. Oh, what kind of business? I briefly explained the concept, how I'd turned my handmade planners into a successful online store, how the business had grown, and how I now employed a team of people to help me manage it. I kept my tone casual, but I didn't downplay the scale of my achievements. Mrs. Reed's expression shifted as I spoke. It wasn't quite shock, but there was definitely a hint of surprise, maybe even a trace of admiration. Well, she said after a pause, that's wonderful. I'm glad to see you found your niche. Her words were polite enough, but they felt hollow. There was no acknowledgement of the role she'd played in my journey, no apology for the harshness of her past remarks. It was as if she had no memory of the day she'd told me I'd never succeed. I paid for my items and left the store, my emotions swirling. The encounter hadn't gone the way I'd imagined, but it gave me something I hadn't realized I needed: closure. Mrs. Reed didn't define me anymore. Her words had hurt me deeply, but they hadn't broken me. If anything, they'd pushed me to prove her wrong, to build a life that was entirely my own. Walking back to my car, I felt a strange sense of peace. The scars she'd left were still there, but they didn't sting anymore. Instead, they served as a reminder of how far I'd come, and how much further I could still go. The conversation with Mrs. Reed in the store was awkward at best. After our initial exchange, we made polite small talk. She asked about my family, and I told her about the wedding that had brought me back to town. In return, I asked about her life, more out of courtesy than genuine curiosity. Her answer caught me off guard. Well, I'm retired now, she said, fiddling with the edge of her cardigan. Teaching doesn't pay as much as people think, and with rising costs, well, I'm looking for part-time work to make ends meet. I blinked, unsure how to respond. In all the years I'd imagined running into Mrs. Reed, I'd pictured her as a figure of authority, still commanding classrooms and wielding that air of superiority. Seeing her like this, humble, almost vulnerable, was jarring. At first, I felt a pang of pity. Whatever else I thought about her, it was sad to see someone who had spent their life teaching now struggling financially. But pity quickly gave way to something else: opportunity. The idea came out of nowhere, hitting me like a bolt of lightning. I needed help with cleaning and organizing my home, tasks I never had time for anymore thanks to my growing business. And here was Mrs. Reed, casually mentioning that she was looking for work. The thought was so unexpected that I almost laughed out loud. Could I really hire my former teacher, the woman who had once humiliated me in front of an entire classroom, to do my chores? It felt absurd, almost surreal, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Part of me hesitated. It felt strange, even a little petty, to offer her a job given our history. Would it seem like I was trying to get back at her? Was it even ethical to blur those lines between student and teacher, employer and employee? But another part of me couldn't ignore the poetic justice of the situation. Here was someone who had dismissed me as a failure, now potentially working for me, a symbol of how far I'd come and how much I'd grown. I decided to test the waters. I actually might know of something, I said, keeping my tone casual. I've been so busy with my business that I'm looking for someone to help out around the house. Cleaning, organizing, things like that. It's flexible, and it pays decently. Mrs. Reed's eyes lit up, and for the first time, I saw genuine excitement on her face. Really? That sounds perfect, she said quickly. I'm good at that sort of work. I've always been organized. It's what made me a good teacher. I bit back a smile at her attempt to tie her teaching skills to housework, but I nodded. Great. Why don't we exchange numbers, and I can give you more details later? As we said our goodbyes, I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me was still grappling with the surreal nature of what had just happened. Had I really just offered Mrs. Reed, a woman who had once told me I'd never succeed, a job cleaning my house? But another part of me felt something close to satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge or proving a point anymore. It was about taking control of the narrative, about showing myself, and maybe Mrs. Reed, that I had moved beyond her hurtful words and built a life I could be proud of. When I got back to my car, I sat for a moment, staring at her number on my phone. The tables had turned in a way I never could have predicted, and I wasn't sure what would happen next. But one thing was certain. This was an opportunity one couldn't pass up. A few days after our unexpected encounter at the store, I decided it was time to follow through on the offer. Sitting at my desk with my phone in hand, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and apprehension. This was a moment I'd never imagined, not even in my wildest daydreams about confronting Mrs. Reed. I dialed her number and waited as the line rang. When she picked up, her voice was as sharp and composed as I remembered from her teaching days. "Hello, this is Linda Reed," she said, a tone of formality that made me suppress a smile. "Hi, Mrs. Reed, this is Alex," I said. "We met at the store the other day." Her tone softened immediately. "Oh, Alex, it's so nice to hear from you." We exchanged pleasantries before I got to the point. I explained the job, keeping my pitch as professional as possible. The position would involve light cleaning, organizing, and occasionally running errands. It's part-time, and I'm flexible with the schedule. The pay would be $25 an hour, and I'd provide any supplies you need. There was a brief pause before she answered, but when she did, her voice was almost eager. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "I'd be happy to take it on. When can I start?" Her enthusiasm surprised me. I'd expected at least some hesitation. After all, this was a far cry from the authority she once wielded in a classroom. But her quick acceptance made one thing clear. She needed this job. The following week, Mrs. Reed showed up at my house for her first day. She was punctual, arriving 5 minutes early and dressed in simple, practical clothing. As I opened the door to greet her, I noticed she looked more relaxed than she had at the store, though there was still a trace of nervousness in her eyes. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity," she said as I welcomed her in. Her tone was polite but humble, a far cry from the confident, commanding teacher I remembered. "No problem," I replied, keeping my own tone neutral. "Let me show you around." As I walked her through the house, explaining the tasks I needed help with, I caught glimpses of the stern Mrs. Reed I'd known in high school. She asked pointed questions about my preferences for cleaning supplies and organization, taking notes in a small notebook she'd brought with her. Her efficiency was almost intimidating, but it also reminded me why she'd been such a respected teacher, despite her harshness. Once we finished the tour, she got to work immediately, starting in the kitchen. I stayed nearby at first, partly to answer any questions and partly because I couldn't resist observing her in this new role. It was surreal watching her clean my countertops and organize my pantry, tasks I'd never imagined someone like Mrs. Reed doing. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and yet there was no malice in my heart. If anything, I felt a strange sense of closure. As she worked, I noticed small flashes of her old self. She moved with purpose, her posture straight, and her expression focused. It was clear she approached this job with the same seriousness she'd once brought to teaching. But now, there was a humility about her that hadn't been there before, a quiet acknowledgement of her new reality. At one point, as she wiped down the dining table, she paused and looked up at me. "You've done well for yourself, Alex," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my tone even. She hesitated, as if weighing her next words carefully. "I know I wasn't the easiest teacher," she said finally, "and I might have been harsh at times, but I always wanted my students to succeed." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I didn't push her for more, but I could tell there was something deeper behind her statement. Maybe regret, maybe pride, maybe both. As she went back to work, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. This wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about proving a point. It was about reclaiming my story and reminding myself that her words no longer had power over me. Mrs. Reed had once been a symbol of my self-doubt, but now, she was just a person trying to make a living. And in that moment, I realized I'd truly moved on. As the weeks turned into months, having Mrs. Reed work in my home became less strange and more routine. At first, our interactions were limited to polite exchanges about tasks and schedules. She was efficient and professional, always arriving on time and doing her work thoroughly. But as time went on, Our conversations began to extend beyond the surface. While she cleaned or organized, I'd occasionally ask how she was doing, and she'd share small snippets about her life. Each story revealed a little more about the woman who had once been such an intimidating figure in my life. One day, as she meticulously rearranged the books on my shelf, she sighed and said, "You know, retiring wasn't what I thought it would be. I always imagined I'd be able to relax and enjoy myself, but life doesn't always work out that way." Her words caught my attention. I put down my work and turned to her. "What do you mean?" I asked. She paused, as if deciding how much to say. "Teaching wasn't easy," she admitted. "Especially toward the end. The kids were harder to reach, the administration expected more than we could give, and the pay never seemed to catch up with the cost of living. By the time I retired, I was exhausted." I nodded, unsure how to respond. I'd always seen her as this unshakable authority figure, but now I was beginning to understand that she'd been carrying her own struggles all along. Over the next few visits, she opened up even more. She talked about the toll teaching had taken on her mental health, the frustrations of trying to keep up with changing standards, and the loneliness that had crept in after she retired. "I gave so much of myself to that job," she said one day, wiping down the kitchen counters. "And by the end of it, I didn't have much left." One afternoon, while she was dusting the living room, our conversation took an unexpected turn. "Alex," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about our time in the classroom." I looked up from my laptop, curious. "Oh." She put down the cloth she was holding and sat on the edge of the couch. "I know I wasn't always kind," she said, meeting my gaze. "I pushed my students hard, and sometimes I crossed the line. I let my frustrations get the better of me, and I said things I shouldn't have." My heart skipped a beat. I could tell where this was going, but I stayed silent, letting her continue. "I remember being especially hard on you," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "You struggled in my class, and instead of helping you, I let my bitterness and impatience take over. That wasn't fair to you, and for that, I'm sorry. You deserved better." Her apology hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I'd spent years replaying the hurtful things she'd said, imagining what it would feel like to confront her. But now, hearing her acknowledge her mistakes, I felt an unexpected wave of emotion. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice steady but soft. "I appreciate you saying that." She nodded, her expression a mix of relief and vulnerability. "I've been carrying that regret for a long time," she admitted. "Seeing how well you've done for yourself, it's humbling. And it's a reminder that I didn't always get it right." Her words felt like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for years. The hurt she'd caused was still a part of my story, but her apology gave me the closure I hadn't realized I needed. After that conversation, our dynamic shifted. We began to talk more openly, sharing bits of wisdom and humor as we worked alongside each other. She told me about her favorite students and the moments in her career that had brought her joy, as well as the ones that had left her questioning whether she'd made a difference. In turn, I shared stories about my business, how it had started, the challenges I'd faced, and the dreams I was still chasing. She listened with genuine interest, often offering insights that reminded me of her days as a teacher. Through these conversations, I came to see Mrs. Reed in a new light. She wasn't just the stern teacher who'd once humiliated me. She was a complex, flawed, and ultimately human person who had made mistakes and was trying to make amends. That realization didn't erase the past, but it reframed it. Her harsh words had shaped me in ways I hadn't fully understood until now. They'd fueled my determination, pushed me to prove her wrong, and ultimately led me to the life I was living. And while I would never condone the way she'd treated me, I could finally let go of the bitterness I'd carried for so long. Her apology wasn't just for her, it was for me too. It was a reminder that even the people who hurt us can teach us something valuable. Mrs. Reed had once told me I'd never succeed, but now, here we were, sharing a mutual respect that neither of us could have predicted. And in that moment, I realized I'd already won. Years have passed since I first started my business, and life has transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined back in high school. The struggling kid who couldn't solve a quadratic equation is now running a company that spans multiple product lines, employs a growing team, and reaches customers across the globe. My days are busy but fulfilling. Every morning, I wake up with a sense of purpose, ready to tackle the challenges and opportunities that come with being my own boss. It's a far cry from the person I used to be, the one who felt defined by failure and held back by insecurity. Now, I've built a life I'm proud of, And while I've let go of most of the baggage from my past, there's one part of the journey that remains unexpectedly intertwined with my present, Mrs. Reed. She still works for me occasionally, helping out with tasks around the house. What started as an awkward arrangement has evolved into something almost resembling mutual respect. Our conversations are less guarded now, and I've come to appreciate her work ethic and her willingness to take on any job, no matter how humble. I don't know if she'll ever fully understand the impact her words had on me. I doubt she remembers the specifics of that day in her classroom when she told me I'd never succeed. To her, it might have been just another moment of frustration, lost in the chaos of managing dozens of students every year. But to me, those words were pivotal. They fueled a fire I didn't know I had, pushing me to prove her and myself wrong. And while I've stopped needing her validation, I can't deny the role she played in shaping my journey. One afternoon, as Mrs. Reed was folding laundry in the living room, I asked her a question that had been on my mind for a while. "Do you ever miss teaching?" She paused, considering her answer. "Sometimes," she said finally. "I miss the moments when I felt like I was making a difference. When a student would finally grasp a concept, or when they'd come back years later to tell me I'd helped them in some way. But I don't miss the pressure or the exhaustion." Her honesty caught me off guard. It was a reminder that even the people who hurt us are often struggling in ways we can't see. "And what about you?" she asked, turning the question back on me. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" I smiled, glancing around the room at the life I'd built. "All the time," I admitted. "It still feels surreal sometimes." After she left that day, I sat in my home office, reflecting on everything that had brought me to this point. The long nights spent building my business, the risks I'd taken, the moments of doubt and triumph. It was all part of a journey I wouldn't trade for anything. Mrs. Reed's doubt, once a source of pain, had become my greatest motivator. And the irony of hiring the person who once told me I'd never succeed? That's just the cherry on top of a story I'll never forget. In the end, I didn't need to confront her or seek revenge. Living well truly was the best response. My success wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of more than I ever imagined. And while the scars of her words still linger, they no longer define me. They're just part of the tapestry of my story, a reminder of how far I've come and how much further I can go. I've built a life filled with purpose, growth, and the confidence that I once thought was out of reach. And as I look ahead, I'm grateful for every twist and turn that brought me here, even the ones that hurt the most.